All right, ladies and gentlemen. See how I switched that? Do you see it now that I'm recording? It's like, all right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have the one and only Ankush Jain, um, coach, author of Sweet Sharing, which is, by the way, an absolutely incredible book. If you guys want a way, I hear this all the time, and I think this is going to be a cool conversation. How do I share the principles? Do I have to share mind, consciousness, and thought? And the minute you open the book with Ankush, he starts with an incredible story, and you just get immersed into his world, how he sees life. And you learn not because he's sharing his point of view, but you connect to your own reality and your experiences because it just drops you into speaking like you're speaking to a friend. So kudos to your book, by the way. For those that haven't seen it, it is on Amazon, and it's readily available, and I highly recommend everyone to grab a copy. And we'll talk about that more at the end. But today we do have somebody that I absolutely love. I've worked with him. We created a program together. I knew of him before we created the program. He's always has incredible stuff to say when he's writing, or he's interviewing, or he's being interviewed. And he's just a kick-ass dude. And I'll tell you a quick story before we get him on. Right before we were supposed to start our program, I wanted to quit. I did. I called him. I'm like, look, I have too much going on. I run a chain of restaurants here in San Diego, and I was ready to just drop out. And he wouldn't let me. Like, he says, look, we said we're going to do it. We'll figure it out, and I will support whatever I need to do on my end to get this going. And what I realized is that when you have somebody on your team like him who doesn't let your stories in your head get in the way, and he supports you 100%, man, that changed the way that we work together. So I got to actually experience someone on my team help me out in such a deep level that it actually made our program even better, because I got to share that same kind of compassion to the group members. So Ankush, welcome to this call, and I am so excited to get started. Before we get started, tell us a little bit about your new book. How's it going so far? What are people saying about it? I'm sure really good.
Yeah, no, thank you for that introduction, Amir. And it's very cool to be on here with you. Actually, one of my clients sent me a link to your interview with Bill Pettit this morning, which I listened to, which was absolutely amazing. So it's very cool to watch that and listen to it this morning, and then be on this group with you today, and see so many familiar names and faces as well in the group. The book's going well. I remember you and I had a conversation. I don't know if you can remember this, but you and I had a conversation some time ago about another 3P book that was out there, and you were saying, I really want to get to know the author, and we were talking about how there are other books that are out there that become very impersonal, and this is not right or wrong, but how you and I both really resonated with books where we felt like we got to know the author. And what happened was, funnily enough, when I wrote the book, I wrote the manuscript, it wasn't as personal as it turned out. And I gave it to someone whose opinion I really value, a publisher called Maurice Bassett. And everyone else was telling me how the manuscript was wonderful and great. And Maurice was maybe scathing is too strong a word. Maurice was critical of it. And one of the things he kind of brought out was how the first chapter was really strong, but I then went very impersonal in the rest of the book and just went, well, this is how the mind works. And I really, took that on board and took some time to go back to the book. And I worked with my wonderful editor, a guy called Chris Nelson, to make the book better by fleshing it out a bit and giving some more examples, but also mindfully bringing more of my story into the book and consciously making it more personal, because I really learn through stories, and I realize that the books that I really love, so I really love Steve Chandler's books, for example, and he does this very well. to consciously change the book. And I'm glad that I've done it, because I seem to be getting messages every day, every week, certainly, from people who are telling me that they really resonate with the book. And what's very interesting for me is, firstly, I just literally wrote a post about this. Two things. One, the kinds of people that are reading my book are people I would never have expected. I got an email from a girl who I'd met at a wedding, like 10 years ago. And we kind of, she lives in a different country. We were like pen pals almost, but we haven't spoken for a very long time. And she just sent me an email. Hey, I bought your book. I read it and I loved it. So one was the kind of people who are reading it. And I've had school friends and former colleagues and all sorts of people read it. But two is that every single person seems to be resonating with a different chapter. So whilst one person might resonate with the chapter on anger, someone will resonate with the piece around parenting, and someone else will resonate with the thing about, pressure to get into a certain school. It's very interesting how different people seem to really resonate with different parts of the book.
Yeah, I agree. There was chapters that stuck out for me more than others for that same reason. It somehow connected to where I'm at in my life. And I went, oh, this is perfect. It's literally like talking to you at a coffee shop. And I've always loved those kind of books where you feel like you're sitting down and the person that wrote the book is across from you. So yeah, great job on that book. And, we didn't actually really talk about what we're going to talk about today. And so I want to do a couple things. I want to just expand on the idea. I'm starting to see, I guess in our community still, the idea of sharing the principles is still a very difficult thing for people in our community. And like I said, we didn't talk about this, but I still see this idea of, how do I share it with a family member? How do I share it? There's people that think what I'm talking about is absolutely nuts. And I don't know how to put this in a way that makes sense to them. And I'm wondering if you've ever, first of all, had that kind of issue. And what do you kind of do in situations when you're trying to explain something that's very spiritual, kind of difficult to grasp? What do you find valuable, whether it's with coaching clients or people in general?
Well, there's no one answer to that. I think it's one of the things that I learned is that, human beings, whilst I guess on one hand, you could say we're all divine consciousness, and we're all the essence of the principle of mind, or we talk about oneness. And another way, we're very diverse. The personality is very diverse, and I found that there's no one answer. There's no one strategy. Like, okay, this is what you do. This is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. But what I found is that it's really helpful just to meet people where they're at. So, one thing that I know you've done a lot of, and one thing that I've done a lot of, is I've bought books for people, right? Now, for some people, that would be a terrible thing to do, right? Some people take a year to read a book. Some people just don't like reading a book. So that doesn't make sense to do so. But some people really do. Some people love books. So, buying a book for someone is great. Now, I remember when I first came across the principles, it seemed to be that the thing to do was only to buy Sid Banks books for people. And I can see why people do that. I know kind of Bill was, when I was listening this morning, Bill was talking about referring people to Sid. And I refer people to Sid, but it depends on who it is. And I remember many years ago, I was talking to a recruitment consultant who I knew through my work. And this guy was very logical, and, it was more of a business conversation. It was very logical. Well, I bought a copy of the Little Book of Clarity for him, and he loved it because that kind of met him where he was at. It was very business orientated. I've also spoken at kind of personal development workshops in the past. And when I'm there, often I like to give Michael Neal's book out, The Inside Out Revolution, because that has a different tone to it. It's much more personal and kind of seems to meet that that audience. Um, and then there are people who are quite spiritual. You know, I might embarrass my aunts on this call, and you know, many years ago, I know she was very spiritual, and I had a copy of The Enlightened Gardener, and I gave her a copy of it because I felt that would resonate with her more, and she read that book, and something landed for her, which ultimately is why she's probably on this call today. So it really depends on the person, and that's not just with the book, that's also in conversation. And I try and do that with a lot of, you know, I try to do that with my book, make it something that was very easily shareable. But I also do that with a lot of content that I create, which is not about hold still while I 3P you, hold still while I tell you about mind, thought, and consciousness, and this is how it is, and you need to know this because your life will get better. But more so about, you know, meeting them where they're at, learning about what's going on in their life, working out what is holding them up, or getting in their way, and then sharing with whatever makes sense. And sometimes what makes sense is to really be quiet and listen a lot, and sometimes it might be to be more directive. So there's no one answer to that question. I don't know if this is helpful to people, but that's kind of what I do, is use a little bit of my gut to see what will make sense to the person in front of me.
Yeah, I think that makes 100% sense, and it's a wonderful reminder, because I think when we get into a one-track mind of I'm going to speak to someone and I need to know the answer. Well, first of all, you don't know what their world is. You don't know what they're up to. You don't know what they need. And when we go into a conversation assuming that we already have the answer, we already know it's mind, consciousness, and thought, we already know the principles is going to save the day. Well, like you mentioned, that just removes the person you're speaking to out of the conversation. And a lot of times you come back and say, I don't know what happened. I told them about the principles and they didn't hear it. So maybe something's wrong with them. But I think the last bit that you mentioned, which is sometimes you just have to listen. Sometimes you have to wait and see what's in their world to find out what you need to do. Is that kind of what you're pointing to?
Yeah, pretty much. And I know Mark Howard was really helpful for me with this when Mark Howard he talks a lot about rapport, you know, getting into rapport with people. And I look back at now and see how true that is. And some people might have seen one of the things that I posted this week about the Modelo book. I know most people have probably read it already. It's sat on my shelf for years and years and years, and I left it on the airplane. So then I bought another copy, and because I'd read a few chapters, and I was like, I need to finish this book. But really, that book, you know, the essence of it there was you know, Roger Mills going into a very challenging scenario, challenging situation where people didn't want to know about psychology. They didn't want to know. They wanted very practical help. And the first thing he did was really gain rapport with people, connect with them, let them know he was there to help, and be very human about it. So I think that's very true, that, you know, people who have been doing this a lot longer than I have realized that. And it kind of just makes common sense, you know, like because I think about this a lot for myself. Whenever someone will say, hey, you're wrong, this is the answer, automatically I get defensive. Automatically I'm a little bit hands off. Like, well, what's your agenda here? Whereas when someone's more gentle and more loving and interested in me, and I feel that connection, I'm more open to hearing what they have to say. And you know, maybe I'm a little bit lucky that before I came across the 3 principles, I had been in and around the personal development world for about 10 years. And in that 10 years, I had come across so many concepts and ideas that I knew would make other people better in my life. And I would go around telling them, and they would never listen to me. So by the time I came across the 3 principles, I kind of learnt my lesson a bit. Like, you know, if I go and take that same approach, people aren't going to listen to me. I've learnt that the hard way, if you like. So it you know, I had a bit of that background and experience to be different and gentle. And this is maybe not the answer that people want to hear, but the biggest way I feel we can inspire and impact others is through who we're being in the world, right? And that's not the easy answer. That's not like this is the 3-step process, but the happier we are in our lives, the more we are living the principles day to day, like really, that has an impact. And you know, and by the way, I'm talking to me as much as I'm talking to all of you guys, because I'm not perfect. I've got blind spots, but I see, you know, every 6 months, every year, I look back and I can see, okay, a little bit of ego's fallen away, a little bit of my misunderstandings have fallen away. You know, I'm seeing things that little bit clearer, and it's not just me. Often my clients will comment on it, or sometimes I'll speak to someone, and then I'll speak to them a year or two later, and they're like, "You're different now." And that just seems to happen constantly, and the more that happens, the easier I find that I'm able to have those conversations with people, not because I've got better words or a better, you know, method or system to explain things to people, but it's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I always think it's funny when people are going, I need to make sure to share the principles so everyone else can be happy. And I'm going, well, look at where you're coming from. Like, you're so concerned about everyone's happiness and make sure they get it, and you're putting all this undue stress on yourself over all this thinking that you want other people not to have, right? And I think what you said is absolutely brilliant. It starts with you. That idea of, well, if you want to share happiness, show them your happiness. If you want to show them compassion, let them see your compassion. If you want to show love, let them see your love. And I think that is more intriguing than telling people what love looks like or where thought comes from. I think it's a wonderful entry point to any conversation when they go, I want what they have. What is it that they have? And I think that you model that perfectly with when you share, even with this call today. You know, we haven't discussed really much of the principles, but the way that you're showing up makes people go, well, I want some of that.
Can I add something as well? Because I'm just thinking about what I said, and what I don't want people to take away from this is, oh, I'm not ready yet to share because maybe I'm not grounded enough. Because there's a danger that people might hear that. And I want to kind of add this caveat to what I just said, is that everyone here, you're all qualified. Everyone here, you're already, you know enough. And I was naive enough that I did a 3-day training with Jamie Smart and Garrett Kramer. And I got a huge amount from that, don't get me wrong. But, you know, I was naive enough to start sharing like 6.5 years ago, that early on. And I'm really glad that I did it. So, you know, I'm not saying wait until you're more grounded before you start talking to people, but, you know, you can do that now, but do it with I don't know if this is the right word, but doing it with a little bit of humility, right? So, you know, if I went back, and I sometimes think about this, what would I say to myself from 6.5 years ago? And I certainly wouldn't say, well, Ankush, you want to slow down a bit, stop telling people. I wouldn't say that. In fact, I would say the opposite: share more, but don't share as an expert of, hey, I've learned something, you know, but share more as a human being around. Like for me, my first insights were around anger, and were around, you know, a lot of how we're showing up at work, and also showing up with my family. Well, if I just shared that, then, you know, that's enough. And it's not being an expert. It's like, hey, here's what I saw. And you know what? Sometimes when when I started doing this, right, this is kind of the price you have to pay. Some people would say to me, oh yeah, I know that already, right? And I would know that they didn't, but that was okay, because rather than going, well, no, you don't, I kind of just smiled, but it opened up the conversation. Because then if I was just willing to stay there and go, yeah, well, I guess I didn't, right? And then we would just talk from that place of human being to human being, it would open up into a wider conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad you threw that little caveat in there, because if it sounded like I'm saying you can only be happy to share that's the only way you have to share the principles, is when you are happy, when you are grounded. That's not it at all. Because some of my best shares are in the midst of me being anxious. Some of my best shares were in the midst of me being disconnected with my wife and going to the recovery center and saying, look, folks, I have these days, and this is how life looks to me in this moment. And the humility and also the humanness of sharing where you are at, that's part of the grounding, is understanding to the best of your ability that I kind of don't feel okay, but I can still be okay enough to share with you. I kind of feel insecure, but I still have enough security to tell you where I'm at. And that, I think, has more value than saying what we're discussing, which I'm glad you cleared up. It's not saying, I'm not going to share it until I have a certain state of mind. I don't think that's what neither of us were saying, and I'm glad you covered that. And on that note, I wanted to ask if anyone has any questions or any ideas or thoughts that you want to share right now. I would love for you guys. Oh, we have Sue. Let's get her in here real quick. And go ahead and unmute yourself, Miss Sue.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Sue.
Hey, Sue.
Hi. I jumped on this call because I have a real life like need to talk about this. In some wild, crazy creative energy, I did a lot of asking, and I have this week starting a series of 7 weeks of Zoominars with some really awesome 3P guests to join me, and it's all about Simplify Your Life, which is this thing that I'm doing. And now I'm sitting here knowing that it's possible that some people that are not in my 3P life are going to come on these calls. It is possible that there are people who will arrive on these calls that have no jargon, no grounding, no nothing. And I don't want to make a big thing out of it. I don't want to tell my guests to mind their jargon. But I do want to make it as absolutely friendly a playing field for people who aren't going to be familiar. Now, Ankush, I've listened to some of your podcasts, and you handled that really gracefully in your interviews, where if someone would throw jargon into a conversation, you'd say, and for people who aren't familiar with that, would you define it? But I'd love to hear more about how you navigate that kind of situation. The ones I'm doing live by myself, I have nobody to deal with but me, and I know how to manage that, but I don't know how to manage it in a situation like you guys are doing right now. I'd love your input.
Yeah, so
if
before
that
I
was
started,
clear. Does that make sense, Ankush?
Yeah. So before I started my first podcast, I thought I better do some research into how to interview people. So I went to my favorite place for training, which was called Google, and I typed in how to interview people. Right? Like literally, that's what I did.
I like you. Yes.
And one of the first things that came up was a BBC page where they had. I don't know if you're from the US, you're probably not familiar with a guy called Jeremy Paxman, and no. he's a political interviewer, and he's very like he gets in your face kind of thing, right? And he's a very good interviewer.
David Frost kind of guy.
Yeah, like he challenges politicians, right? And so he had like a 2-minute thing about how he interviews, and he's so I thought, okay, let me see what he has to say. And the thing that I took away from that was he said, I always ask what I think the audience want to know. And that was my training. Like that was it. So when I went and started doing my podcast, and I created a little 1-page document, which I would send to the people I was interviewing and saying, well, look, this is what the show's about, and this is what I'm going to, how it's structured and whatever. And in there, I'd say, look, my audience for this are people who don't know anything about the 3 principles. And so please no jargon. And I'm going to be asking, either I'd write it in there or I'd tell them before we started recording, I'm going to ask what I think the audience want to know. And if you listen to all the shows, there was one, I won't say who, there was one 3P person who, despite me saying this, forgot and kept using a lot of 3P language. And I kept going back and saying, like you said, well, what do you mean by that? So I just tried to put myself in the shoes of me from before I learnt the principles. And what would me from before I learnt the principles be asking about what the person was saying?
So you don't even have to say, can you translate that into real words? Or you just say, what do you mean by that? That's kind of easy. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm all about simplicity, right? I've never been drawn to overcomplicated, intelligent sounding words for the sake of it. I like to keep things very simple so that I can understand them for myself. And so that's the way I've always communicated. And so when I do my interviews or anything like that, I keep that in mind. So if anyone says something that I don't understand, then I'm pretty sure some other people won't understand it. So then I'll ask the stupid questions. I'm willing to say, well, what do you mean by wisdom, right? Or when you say, whatever, universal intelligence, what do you mean by that? Is this a religious thing? Now, I might know what the person's pointing to, but I'm not me in that moment. I'm the uninformed listener. That's my role in that situation.
Oh, Ankush, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. Amir, got anything too?
No, he pretty much summed it up, and the only thing I'll add is I was crap when I started. That's all I will say. I mean, it's just the name of the game. I navigated the best that I could, and eventually I started to realize what Ankush realized, which is um, the simpler you make it, and when the guests say something like, universal mind has your back, a lot of times I just literally mirror what they say and let them expand. Universal mind has your back. What does that do? They go, well, yeah, because, and then they'll continue, and then they'll say something else. And then
Nice.
from there, they'll say, yeah, because, think about it, everything works one way. Yeah. And so typically that will help you expand on it when you use the same verbiage that they're using.
Right.
I don't know why that works. I just realized that after doing several of these interviews from 2015. But the best thing you've got going for you, Sue, is that you're doing it.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, that's the best thing you got going for you. I mean, me and Ankush can tell you, oh, you should do this, you should see that, and it'll be very useful. Don't get me wrong. But Ankush today, how many have you done now? Your relationship series, how many people did you interview?
In total, there were, I think, 46 episodes. One of them was Jill, who's here. I think she interviewed me. But so there were 45 other episodes, and I've done another 20 or so for my business series podcast, and then a whole bunch of webinars. But yeah, like you can hear them if you go through the episodes. You can hear how I've improved from the first episode to the last episode. There's quite huge differences.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Absolutely. And I don't know how many interviews I've done now from 2015 till now, but you just get better and you just start seeing the nuances and you'll still screw up and you'll still make mistakes and you'll look forward to the next time because you caught yourself with the mistakes from last time and you just start to get better. And that's what I've at least seen.
That's really helpful. Thank you both. And Ankush, if I extend the series, since you're a fan of simplicity, I might ask you to be one of my guests.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, thank you for the offer, Sue. I'll take it. And oh, sorry, you meant Ankush.
Who knows, Amir? I'm scared.
Well, if she gets really desperate, Amir, she can ask you.
I'm scared myself to death with this lineup I have created. So many people said yes. I can't believe it. But hey.
Yeah, it's brilliant, and I think you can do a wonderful job. I'm looking forward to it. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So do we have anyone else that wants to ask Kush a question or pick on him? Either way, I'd be more than happy with the second part, but I'd take questions as well. Anyone else? You know, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you something that I ask all of the people I interview, Ankush, and I want to know your take on this, because you've worked with several different. I don't know if you want to say camps in the principles, but what do you think is important when? Here I'll say it the way I always I say it. What's the best direction people should look into when they want to share the principles? Like, what do you think would be valuable for them? Because there is the single paradigm, there's clarity, there's, inside out, there's, teach mind, consciousness, and thought, teach it as a spiritual thing, teach it as a logical thing. In your opinion, what do you see has been worthwhile for you as far as exploring the direction of sharing the principles?
So this is, I blame you, Amir, because every time we talk, you bring out the kind of cheeky side of me. So the cheeky side of me wants to say, well, obviously hire Ankush, because that's the best way to move forward with this. But joking aside, again, this is just so like personal, and we get drawn to what we get drawn to. So like for some people, they'll go, and I've met people who've said, oh, I read a Sydney Banks book and it changed my life, and that was it. And I remember when I first read a Sydney Banks book, I read The Missing Link, and I read it in about half an hour, and I'm reading the book going, where's the good stuff? And I get to the end, and I'm reading the praise for the book going, this is the best book ever, or whatever. And I'm like, what? There's nothing. And I flick the book open again, I read another bit, and I'm like, this isn't saying anything, right? And then I come back to it a year later, and it's now one of my favorite books. And it's so dense and so packed with wisdom. But it's just different things we get drawn to at different times. And sometimes I feel like I should want to be drawn to the latest thing. So, at different times, different things seem to be, drawing a lot of people in, and you mentioned a bunch of different things. And sometimes I should want to be drawn to that, but we get drawn to what we get drawn to. And that's totally fine. And one thing that I say, and I spoke to a first generation teacher about this, who shall remain nameless. And I said, hey, while you guys are all arguing with each other about what's the right way to share the principles, and how the way you're saying it is the way Sid really meant it to be, right? I'm like, we forget that it doesn't matter how we share this, that people are getting helped. Surely that's the most important thing. And I don't know if I'm out of line for saying that. And I've said this to other people, and I've been pulled up on it. Someone said, well, we're not all fighting. I don't know. I don't know if you see, I see disagreements between people and different camps, as you say. I clearly see that. And to me, everyone's doing the best they can. And what I see is that, with the best of intentions, people are trying to articulate in the best way what they saw and what they learned from Sid. And I think we're very lucky that we get to hear different interpretations of that. So I personally get a lot from Keith Blevins explaining the principles as a logic and a psychology. And that's really been helpful for me personally, but also in working with a bunch of clients. And equally, I've got so much from speaking to Mark Howard, and his way of like getting into rapport and just sharing what you know. And then I've got so much from Dickin Bettinger, who just, I feel, is, the principles is all love, and he just models that effortlessly. Everyone that I hear talk about the principles, whether it's Elsie or Chip or Jamie or Michael, I get so much from my clients. I get so much from myself, and I don't mean that in an arrogant way. Sometimes I'll be coaching someone or teaching someone, and words will come out of my mouth, and it'll suddenly hit me. Oh, those are the words I need to hear most right now. So to me, there is wisdom, everywhere if we're willing to look at it. I mean, Sid said that. I remember Eckhart Tolle would talk about this. Before I came across the principles, I used to listen to Eckhart Tolle constantly on repeat in my car. And, he would say he once saw a sign which said, "Keep off the grass." And he saw that as a spiritual truth. So, it's, I don't get too hung up on what's the right way. I just say to people, hey, if there's something in this, if there's something that I'm pointing you to or someone else is pointing you to that intrigues you, that you think there's something there for you, go and explore that. Go and scratch that itch. And if there's not, if you think I'm talking horseshit, then by all means, that's okay. Like, I'm not hung up on it. It's okay. And that seems to work well for people. I remember Steve Chandler told me this, and he got this from Dickon. Steve was telling me a conversation he had with Dickon Bettinger about how Dickon said something along the lines of, it's so amusing to hear people say, trust your wisdom, except when your wisdom doesn't agree with my wisdom, then trust my wisdom. Right? And I've never forgotten that. Right? It's like it either trust your wisdom or trust my. You can't have it both, right? So if we trust people to trust their wisdom, and they are complete and whole and sitting in the middle of perfect mental health, then we've got to trust that, including if that means they don't look into the principles right now. And I've spoken to people that I really care about, who I can see are suffering. And I'm kind of saying to them, just look in this direction, and they just don't want to. And that's absolutely fine, because it's very arrogant of me to think they need to do that because that's going to be the best thing for them. How arrogant. I'm not all knowing. Like on one way we all are all knowing, but in terms of Ankush, it's not all knowing and knows what's best for every other person. I'm just trying to figure this out for myself. So if I can be of help, great. And ultimately, I have to drop my own ego around this.
Yeah. And man, just with the last bit that you said about helping others, it used to take up so much of my headspace after I discovered the principles. I thought that everybody needs to know this. I need to share this with everyone. If they're unhappy, I need to make sure that they know this so they're happier. And it was and I realized looking back how egotistical and arrogant it was, that I somehow have this magic thing now, and everyone else all of a sudden needs it when they were just fine without me for however many years. And yeah, that just hit home for me. And you did mention something. Oh, we have a hand raised again. So Sue, I'll get right to you. You did mention when you're coaching or teaching someone the principles, you said that when you were talking, when you're coaching, how much teaching do you do and how much coaching do you do? And what's the difference? Like when someone hires you, is there a distinction when you're coaching and teaching? Because I know that you mentioned you have hired both teachers and you've hired coaches, and they have two distinct differences in your point of view. But when you're coaching, do you do both, or do you set the table and say, here, this is a teaching moment, or how do you set the table with that?
I do both. So, but I'm very clear, and it's been helpful for me to be clear about what's what. So to me, coaching is helping the client get to the answer for themselves. So coaching for me is a lot more questioning and helping the client see something for themselves. And then teaching or consultancy is telling the client, right? And I do a bit of both. I can do pure coaching. I can do pure teaching. Generally, when I work with people, I kind of do both. But there's no one way. I heard someone said to me once that they were told that 3P coaching involves more teaching. I think that's just made up. I think you could be a pure coach, which is non-directive, not telling anyone well, this is how it works, and be very effective. And in fact, I've actually got a bunch of videos of me coaching on my website where I've coached people who don't know anything about the 3 principles on a whole range of issues. I've done these 30-minute videos, and when I do those are pure coaching, right? I don't think there's any or very little teaching in those. And I've done it the other way. I've sometimes done a lot of teaching with a client, and I can't tell you why. I just show up, and what happens. If I'm very mindful, I can choose to be, pure coaching or pure teaching. But normally when I'm with a client, I'm not really thinking about those things. If I'm trying to teach a coach or a 3 principles professional about the distinction, then yes, I will say, okay, now this is coaching. I'll say, look, now this is teaching, just to make a point. But normally I'm not really bothered about that, and the client's not really bothered about that either. And by the way, if people are interested in this, I hope you don't mind me sharing that.
No, of course.
I interviewed Dominic Scafidi about this, who I know is in this group, and he's brilliantly articulate. And we did a whole interview webinar on the difference between coaching and teaching, and that's up on YouTube, and it's really, really good. So if people are interested in that, I would strongly encourage you to watch that video.
Yeah, I agree. That was he makes distinctions between consultant, expert, coaching, teacher, therapist. It was very very fascinating and intriguing. It kind of helped me sift out kind of where I stand. Sue, let's get back to you.
Oh, okay. So you asked the question, why did I raise my hand? Oh, I think you asked about what do you share from? Is it, do you share this or that? Or I get really scared about that I don't know enough, and I don't have a mature enough understanding. And the only thing that I can really do and feel like I'm 100% authentic is just to share what I've seen. And for me, that's pretty much the inside out. I started with the inside out understanding. I start with how much better my life is now that I'm not pouring napalm on all my problems and turning them into conflagrations. And that's, I have ownership of that understanding, and I can talk about it. And if I just stay there, I'm good. But otherwise I get really flustered and nervous that I'm not going to say it right, and I don't really know it well enough. So anyway, that's why I raised my hand.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. This is something that I had in my mind from years gone by. When I was coaching and people were paying me for coaching, they don't, most of the time, I'd say 99% of the time, they don't care about the process. Like they don't care if I'm coaching or teaching. They don't care if it's single paradigm or I don't know, something else. They don't care, right? They care about what they care about, and I think that sharing what we know, like you said, I remember I heard Mark Howard say that many years ago, has been so helpful for me. In fact, that's what helped me write a book, because I certainly didn't feel qualified to write a 3 principles book, but I knew I could write what I knew about, right? Like, it's there. So, and that's true for all of us. And it's funny because I sometimes look back and how kind of 3 months into learning the principles, I really didn't feel ready or knowledgeable enough or knowing enough or all this stuff. And now I look back and I realize, with what I knew, the tiny bit that I knew, I could have launched my whole career off that. That what little I saw about anger was, and of course I'm biased, but I think is more powerful than all of the anger management techniques that are out there. So if the only thing I took away from the principles was my anger wasn't telling me about the other person or the situation, it was, and I don't say this now, but at the time what I saw was, it's telling me about state of mind. Now I don't use those words now, but if that's the only thing I took away, I could have run a whole career on, the anger coach or whatever, right? And been able to help a hell of a lot of people. So, and I think it was Sid Banks who said many years ago, you know, your insight is your qualification. So anything that we've seen for ourselves, yeah, well, we're experts on that. We're knowledgeable on that. And I think it's a weird thing that on one hand, and you know, kind of coming back to what we said at the start of this call, I do see that the deeper my own grounding is, i.e., the deeper I embody the principles and really live it, the easier everything else gets. And that's kind of like the icing on the cake. It's not the prerequisite to share. It's like over time, the more you do this, like anything, you get better, and the deeper you understand it, you know, obviously it becomes easier and you become more impactful. But that doesn't mean you got to wait to a certain point, because that's just made up, right? Like we can't stand on a set of scales and it will give us our grounding ratio or quotient, right? Like Amir can't stand on some scales and it'll say, okay, you are 63% grounded, Amir. You need to be 65% before you can do this professionally. You know, gotta go to another 3P course, right?
You know, while you're sharing that, what came to my mind is, folks, we will do okay, and I'll tell you why. Sid Banks never read a 3 Principles book, and he was able to share the principles. He didn't go to a 3 Principles course. He didn't have Dick and Bettinger. He didn't have Elsie Spittle. He didn't have anything that we do now. He actually used his insights and looked within, like everyone always says. And so we get bogged down by the idea, well, what did Sid say? Well, think about that, though. Think about what Sid said. Well, where did he get his information from? He really valued what was inside of him. He really saw the truth of what we're already been given. And, you know, I'm going back to the source, and it's not Sid, it's me. Just like the source was for Sid. His source wasn't the enlightened gardener. His source was him. And so on that respect, you know, it's like I'm going back to old school and following that, and it's been doing me wonders to sit back and say a lot of times, in my opinion, not I need to get the answer. It's what can I see from I don't know? What can I see from I don't know the answer right now? And sit with that. Like that, you know, in our day and age where we can get an answer immediately to anything on Facebook, on Google, on anything, that we miss the gift of I don't know. We miss the gift of sitting in a space of confusion and being kind of lost. And I don't know if you want to expand on that, but do you see a problem with not knowing something, even if you're with a coaching client? Is that a pit? Is that a bad thing in your opinion, or what do you see when you don't have an answer?
I think it's a benefit, and I just want to say you've just given me an idea for my next book. You know, since my first book had sweets on it, the next book is going to be called Going Back to the Source, and it's going to have a ketchup bottle on it. But no, I think that it's a positive when we don't know, because it kind of forces us to like really listen. When we know, I remember I did this interview ages ago for this coaching group. I need to find it. I need to Google it and find it. I did this interview for this coaching group ages ago, and they went in a 3P group, and so it was it wasn't Zoom, but it was kind of like this where people were online and they could message. And one of the guy messaged, and it was about coaching. It wasn't about the principles. And he said, I agree with everything Ankush is saying, but he's missing one thing out. And the thing he's missing out is being an expert. And this whole group really was built on, you know, being an expert and being an authority. And that's how they grew their coaching practices. And I just said, why on earth would I want to be an expert? Right? Why? Because when I'm an expert, then I don't learn anything. And when I don't know, that's when my ears are really open. And I marvel. I did a couple of women's immersions with Kathy Casey, where I kind of ran it in person, and she would come in on Zoom. And I learned so much from just listening to her coach, teach, whatever, with the group, because the group would ask her a question, and I'd have the answer, right? Like, oh, I know how to answer that. And she would always go, well, what do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. And she really listened, because it was like she didn't know what the person was asking, and I assumed like I did. But it's really, in fact, I think part of my journey as a professional coach is about becoming less and less and less of an expert. And I know in years gone by, I've had to really consciously change that, because for the first few years of my coaching journey, I thought I had to be, and I was trying to build up credibility and expertise and being an authority. And then I spent the next few years trying to dismantle that, because number one, it wasn't true, and two, it just gets in the way. It gets in the way of relationship with other people. It gets in the way of connection, right? Now that's not to say that I don't have expertise, I don't have knowledge and skills. Of course I do, just as everyone does on this call. But that's not what people are paying for, in my opinion. And it's not what results in impact. It's not what results in transformation. It's not what results in change and shift, or something that Kathy Emerson said recently, miracles. She said they used to call it miracles in the early days. That doesn't come from being an expert, you know. So I don't know if that answers your question.
That was actually, like, I'm going to cut that piece off and share that with the group. I thought that was absolute gold. And we only have 9 minutes left. And Pramila wants to ask you a question. So let's get to Miss Pramila. How are you? It's good to see you.
What I wanted to say was what Sue said, how do I share, and what am I doing? I've had this problem ever since I first got the book from Ankush. You know, how do I present that? How do I talk about it? How do I say anything? The other day when Nikki Carpenter did a coaching session with me, that really, really resonated, really showed me. Because all this time I've been, well, I know this. Like Ankush said, you know, when he presents it to family, a lot of people say, well, I already know this. We're from that background. And when I look at all the other religions, they're all pointing to the same thing. And it's all being pointed that it's coming from our thoughts and everything. But when Nikki actually pointed it out to me, that what is the difference how people are presenting in all the religions, in all the school of thought, and what the 3P is doing. One thing is that we are always pointing people back to who they really are. And we're always pointing that our feelings are coming from our thought. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, because it's always coming back. Now I can say, like Ankush is saying, coaching, you can interrogate, you can question, well, where is it coming from? And I saw that in all of the coaching calls, all of the webinars that I've been on. But I never could get to that, oh, okay, there's just one difference. Otherwise, everything's the same to me. And now I have a way of maybe coming out and seeing it and say, okay, what's the difference? Where is it coming from? Now that question is making sense. I don't know whether it relates to anything that's being said, but I just have to say that right now.
I think that's a really good point. You know, I've heard on this group, I've heard in a lot of communities, 3P communities, where people have said, well, you know, this is all pointing to the same source anyway. This is the same. This is what the Stoics said. and this is what Buddhists point to, and this is what everyone else points to. And for me, what was really helpful, and for me personally, Keith Blevins really helped me see this. Well, what's different about the principles than everything else? What's the distinction? And anyone can pick me up on this. So if I'm wrong, I would like to know, because then I can learn from that. But one thing that I've seen is that there's no other religion or modality or teaching which they all point to thought having something to do with our experience, but no other nothing else points to it being 100%. And the difference between thought being 100% of our experience and some number lower than 100% to 0% is huge. And again, in my first few years of learning about the principles, this was what was so helpful, because, and I think it was Jamie who said to me, like, if it's 99%, then if you're really annoyed about something or upset about something, well, you can place that as the exception. That can go into the 1%. But if it is 100%, then you've got nowhere to hide. Right? So I'll give you a quick example. If I'm upset with a family member, whether it's my daughter, my sister, my parents, my wife, if I'm upset with a family member, and my religion or something teaches me that, well, your suffering is coming from your thinking, right? Well, I can go, yeah, I know that, but the way she acted is causing me to think these thoughts, right? Her behavior has got something to do with my thinking, because it's not described as a principle. It's not described as a complete and whole law in and of itself, as far as I'm aware. And again, if I'm wrong, please correct me. Whereas with the principles, it is. So with the principles, it's 100%. That 100% of your experience is coming via thought, and the other person or the situation has nothing to do with it. It's ruthless. That's what I use for the principles. It's ruthless. It's cutting a sword through my victim story, right? I cannot, if it works, and that's why, one of the things that changed in the book very late on with the chapter titles. And one of the bits of feedback I got from Keith was, he goes, you know what, your chapter titles are very innocuous, right? Like one of the chapters was called like just racism, right? And he said, well, that doesn't, he goes, you're really pointing to something quite radical in your chapter. So I went through and I changed some of the chapter titles to say, like, racism is not an exception. I kind of expanded it out a bit, right? Because he said, you're saying something very different to kind of common wisdom or what's commonly written out there. And that comes from it being 100%. Because if I didn't know it was 100%, then racists have got something to do with my feeling about racism, right? And then I naturally fall into being a victim of their behavior, of their words. And, that's not true. And again, the immersion events that I run, I call them powerful men's immersions. I've done powerful women's immersions. I picked that word very consciously because to me, the principles have really helped me step into my own power because they give me nowhere to hide. I can't be powerless. I can't be a victim because it's 100%, because there's no wiggle room. And for years, people would say, well, the difference with this is they are principles. And I was like, I don't get it. But over time, I think I got what they were pointing to, that they're principles, they're laws, they're facts, and therefore there's no wiggle room. It's not like you're thinking most of the time, apart from when your neighbor is playing loud music, right? Or you're thinking most of the time, except when, you're thinking about your past. No, it's 100%. So thank you I'm going to be aware of the time, Amir. Thank you for the question. And it's it's really true. And I think it's really important to look at what is different about the principles versus other things.
Yeah, I loved what Pramila said as well. And what a beautiful way to end this call. We have 1 minute, and you're going to be in my other group, my VIP group, and we're going to kind of unpack some of the stuff we talked about here. But real quick, how can people find you? How can people know more about you? Do you do coach? You still do one-on-one coaching, right?
Yeah, a lot of one-on-one coaching.
Okay, so how can people find you? What if they want to know more about you? Where do they go?
So the easiest way to get hold of me, well, either I'm on Facebook. So if you're in the group, you can get hold of me on Facebook, or it's via my website, which is Ankush Jain, ANKUSHJAIN.co.uk, and then there's links to everything there, and you can email me from the website.
Yeah, and if for some reason you guys missed all that, you can call me, email me privately, and I'll shoot over his information, and I'll put your website on the show links as well. So it'll be on there if you guys didn't catch that. Folks, it was a pleasure to have all you guys on here again. Ankush, you never cease to surprise me. You are always fun to have, very insightful, and man, I want to do this again if you're down. I always have a good time with you, so if you're open to it, let's do this again.
Thank you very much, Amir. It's been
awesome,
great.
You guys. Thank you for everyone that joined us, listened in, and asked questions, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Take care, you guys. Bye.